the house hadn't always felt hostile. But in the weeks following the assistant's death, it had transformed into something else entirely like a living organism nursing a secret. Walls hummed with a low vibration, lights flickered even when the power was steady, and doors shifted their positions by an inch as if adjusting themselves while no one watched. Yet nothing unsettled Samuel more than the silence, thick, expectant, as if the house were holding its breath. The police returned on a gray morning, 2 officers standing in the doorway with expressions tight enough to betray suspicion. The air grew colder the moment they stepped inside. Even Saran felt it. She crossed her arms, rubbing her shoulders as if an invisible draft brushed past her skin. "Mr. Samuel," the lead officer began, "we have some additional questions." But Samuel understood what it really meant. They weren't convinced by the initial report. They sat in the living room. The officer spoke in dry, precise tones, asking about times, locations, his assistant's last conversations, whether Samuel had noticed anything unusual. Each question seemed designed not to reveal truth, but to catch him in an inconsistency. Samuel answered, but his concentration frayed at the edges. Shadows pooled strangely behind the officers, darker than they should be, deeper than the daylight allowed. When one officer leaned forward, Samuel saw the shadow behind him stretch up the wall like a tall figure bending over the man's shoulder. He blinked. It vanished. "Are you all right, sir?" the officer asked. Samuel forced a nod. But the atmosphere grew heavier, as if something in the house resented their presence. A photo frame rattled faintly on the shelf. One officer glanced at it, frowning. Another movement, a soft thud from the hallway made Saran flinch. "Old house?" the younger officer asked. "It's never done that before," Saran whispered. David appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes locked on the officers. He didn't say anything, but his presence felt protective, almost defiant. Then came the moment that shifted the entire investigation. The lead officer checked his notes, then looked directly at Samuel. "We interviewed your neighbors. Someone said they heard you arguing with your assistant the night before you died, loudly." Samuel felt the floor tilt beneath him. "There was no argument," he insisted. But his voice trembled only slightly, yet the officer caught it. Before the tension could snap, something happened that turned the direction of the investigation upside down. A loud crack echoed through the ceiling like a heavy step right above them. Dust drifted from the rafters. Everyone looked up. The officer stood sharply, hand on his holster. "Is someone else in the house?" he demanded. "No," Samuel said. "We're the only ones here." But the sound came again, another step, slow, deliberate, dragging across the attic floor. The officers exchanged a glance. "Stay here," the lead said. They climbed the staircase. Each creak of the steps felt amplified, echoing down the walls. David moved closer to Samuel and whispered, "They're hearing it too." "It's not just you anymore." Saran stood behind them, trembling. Minutes ticked by. Then came the officers, returned descending the stairs quicker than they'd climbed them. Their faces were stiff, unnerved, not by anything violent, but by the fact that the attic was completely dust-covered and undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks. No sign anyone or anything had been up there. "We didn't find anything," the lead officer said, but his voice lacked certainty. The younger officer added, "But there definitely was something moving." Silence pooled between them. The officers exchanged a final look, the kind that said the case was slipping out of logic. The lead officer closed his notebook slowly. "For now, we're closing the file as an accidental death. The scene doesn't support foul play. It was a decision made not from confidence but from discomfort, from wanting to be out of the house." As they left, Saran stood by the window, watching their car drive away with a strange mixture of relief and dread. "They think you're innocent," she said quietly. "But I don't think they believe it." Samuel didn't answer. The house grew colder. That night, the hallucinations sharpened. Not vague shadows, not flickers manifestations. The presence of Amaka became undeniable. She appeared at the edge of hallways, her form hazy and flickering like a figure trapped between realities. Her eyes held no malice but a terrifying insistence. He saw her sitting at the foot of the bed, standing by the kitchen door, reflecting in mirrors where she did not belong. Her voice carried no breath, yet Samuel heard it clearly in the empty spaces between his heartbeats. "You began this," she murmured. "You cannot turn away now." Samuel staggered back each time she appeared, yet he could not escape her. She didn't haunt him like a ghost, she clung to him like a debt. Later that night, he found himself staring at David's bedroom door, hand hovering inches from the wood, as though drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. A whisper slithered through his mind. Blood began this. Blood must continue. Samuel yanked his hand back as if burned. He rushed down the hall, breath shaking, mind splintering. He tried to sleep, but another dream dragged him under. Chief Aluo appeared again, not in mist this time but in near solid form, his silhouette towering, his cloak shifting like smoke wrapped around bones. His voice vibrated the dream world. You were given fortune. Life requires balance. If you resist, the pact will correct you. Samuel fell to his knees in the dream. You didn't tell me it would be like this. Oluo's face did not move, but the darkness behind him pulsed. You asked for elevation. You opened the door. Samuel woke with a gasp only to find a shadow standing at the foot of his bed, tall, skinny, watching. The room lights flickered violently, and then the shadow stepped backward, melting into the wall. Samuel didn't sleep again that night. By dawn, he realized something terrifying. The police had left. But the true investigation, the one the shadows were conducting, had only begun. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It carved irregular lines through the muddy soil, as if the sky itself were trying to wash away traces of a past too heavy to bear. Samuel watched those watery paths from the small window of his room, unable to understand why the world suddenly felt too loud, too tight, too alive. Since the night of the fire, his heart had been beating like a drum too strong for his chest, as if something inside was knocking, demanding to be released. No authorities came looking for answers. No investigation, no reports, no explanation. Life in the village simply moved on as if the tragedy had been swallowed by silence. But not for Samuel. And certainly not for David. The wound was still open, breathing, growing. David had found an unexpected refuge in the church of a neighboring village. He went there almost every morning, sometimes without even realizing why. He would walk to the entrance, sit in a shadowed corner, and remain still for long minutes, his eyes empty, as if the air whispered something he was trying to hear. Each visit came with a strange sensation, an invisible tug, a soft pull towards something he could not name. Even he didn't know what guided him there. He believed it was simply a place to breathe, a quiet corner where grief could rest. But in truth, something older was guiding him, an intention hidden within him, placed there long before he understood it. Far from David's silent pilgrimage, Saran, Samuel's wife, had begun her own search for answers. She had seen the shift in her husband, the distant look in his eyes, the long nights where he couldn't sleep, the way he avoided looking at certain corners of the house. She sensed something unspoken weighing on him. She didn't know yet that the center of this weight lay in an object small enough to fit in Samuel's hands. Samuel had found the charm on the night of the fire, buried in the ashes, untouched by the flames. A small black object, deceptively simple, yet heavy with a presence he didn't understand. From the moment he picked it up, he felt something settle into him, quiet, patient, waiting. He had tried to throw it away once, but the next morning it was back under his bed, as if it had never moved. He stopped trying after that. The charm pulsed softly at night, almost like breathing, as though it contained a heartbeat not of this world. And with each passing day, Samuel felt something inside him aligning an urge, a direction, a pull towards something dark, something old, something calling. He did not know it yet, but the charm had chosen him. It was not simply an object. It was a legacy. A generational chain passed from one bearer to the next, compelling its host toward a pact older than memory. A pact never willingly signed, but instinctively completed, driven by the charm itself. While Samuel struggled with this invisible weight, Saran quietly followed the shifts in her husband's behavior. She began searching through old records, speaking to elders, connecting fragments of whispered stories. What she uncovered chilled her more deeply than the rain. Many families in the region had once been tied to forgotten rituals, dark traditions passed down through generations, disguised as blessings but rooted in something far more sinister. Not contracts for wealth, as people once believed, but chains of sacrifice. Cycles in which each generation had to offer something or someone to renew the pact. The charm was not a tool. It was the vessel that carried the will of the pact across time. Anyone who touched it became bound to its hunger. Saran realized that the cycles matched disappearances and tragedies spanning decades. Every bearer had eventually been pulled toward the same destiny. Not by choice, but by instinct shaped by the charm's influence. And now the charm had found Samuel. Meanwhile, David's presence at the church had not gone unnoticed. Father Chaik, the quiet priest with eyes that saw beyond the surface, sensed an unusual disturbance around him. David carried an aura of confusion mixed with awakening, as if something around him, or inside him, was slowly opening. The more Father Chaik observed the young man's silent visits, the more he understood that David was not simply grieving. He was being drawn. The priest began consulting old manuscript texts, so ancient their translations were incomplete. Pages speaking of families chosen, not blessed. Families marked by objects charms that held contracts not written in ink but in lineage. Through these records, connections surfaced. Patterns, cycles, successions. Until the truth became undeniable, Samuel had not been attracted to a pact promising wealth. He was being summoned into a pact of succession? A generational ritual in which each chosen heir was compelled through the charm to continue a line of sacrifices older than their own bloodline, a chain that never broke. A force that sought its next host the moment the former one fell. Saran, through her own research, reached the same horrifying conclusion. The charm did not belong to Samuel, but Samuel belonged to the charm. Each step the three of them took, Samuel with his sleepless nights, Saran with her quiet investigations, David with his inexplicable pilgrimages, was drawing them deeper into the heart of a legacy they had not chosen. A legacy that had already begun tightening its grip. And none of them yet understood that once awakened, this cycle called not only its heir, but its sacrifices. The sky over the city dimmed earlier than usual, sinking into an orange haze that bled into the horizon like a warning. That evening the air felt too heavy to breathe. Even the birds sensed it. Their songs faded, replaced by the kind of silence that carried weight, an ancient, waiting silence. Inside their home, Samuel and Saran moved through the rooms as though walking on fragile ground. Nothing seemed in its place anymore, as if the walls themselves had shifted subtly during the night. For Samuel, the world had begun to feel narrower, squeezing inward one invisible inch at a time. The charm, which he now kept hidden beneath a loose wooden floorboard, pulsed faintly, almost insistently, like a heart trying to beat through stone. He could feel its presence even when he wasn't touching it, a tug behind his ribs, a whisper behind his thoughts. It followed him into every room, casting long shadows where none should exist. Saran watched him closely. She no longer tried to question him. Questions were useless when the person in front of you had begun drifting into a place only he could see. Instead, she observed the subtle changes, the way Samuel turned toward voices no one else heard, the way he paused at dark corners, his eyes widening slightly before he forced himself to blink away whatever he thought he saw. She had grown careful, cautious, walking as though each movement could trigger something inside her husband. She still loved him deeply, but she no longer recognized the man before her. And the charm, though hidden, seemed to breathe through him. She felt its pull indirectly, like a cold draft that passed through her bones whenever Samuel entered a room. Far away in the small church, David had begun experiencing restless nights. Sleep no longer carried comfort, but visions, pieces of something he could not fully assemble. He saw flames, yes, but now he saw more. A black shape pulsing like a heartbeat, a doorway, a shadow reaching toward Samuel. And beneath it all, an old voice chanting words he did not know. Words that echoed long after he woke. He didn't tell anyone. Not even Father Chaik, who had started sensing an unsettling weight around David every time he walked through the church doors. The priest didn't ask directly, but he watched in silence, understanding that something old and dangerous had begun tightening around the young men. He continued his search through the old manuscripts' records of generations cursed by relics that carried ancestral wills. Objects that did not simply follow families, they chose their next bearers. In those texts, he found a chilling revelation. The charm awakens when the bearer loses blood that must be replaced, and Samuel had already spilled blood. Father Chaik's heart tightened. He began praying more fervently, asking for discernment, knowing very well that his role in this unfolding darkness was not accidental. Something guided David to the church, and something guided the priest's hand to the records he hadn't touched in years. But he knew he could not interfere prematurely. The darkness surrounding Samuel had already grown too aggressive. If he approached too soon, the pact might shift its focus toward him, accelerating its hunger. He needed to wait for the right moment, when truth could be delivered without sparking the final descent. Meanwhile, Samuel felt time slip in. His nights grew longer, sometimes disappearing entirely without memory. He would wake in places he didn't remember entering outside the house. Near the old forest, once even beside the ashes of the burned village. Whenever he returned home, Saran asked him where he had gone. He didn't know. He only knew one thing: something inside him was preparing. The charm was no longer just calling, it was aligning his will to its own. One night, Saran woke suddenly. She didn't know what disturbed her, but the air felt wrong, like the moment before a storm breaks. She reached for Samuel, but the space beside her was empty. A chill swept through her. She stood slowly, careful not to make any noise, and followed the faint sound of movement in the living room. She saw Samuel standing in the dark, facing the wall. His posture stiff, his head tilted slightly as though listening. She couldn't see what he was looking at. Then, slowly, he turned. His eyes weren't blank, they were focused on something she couldn't see. "Samuel," she whispered. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded as though pushed from far away. "It's almost time." "Time for what?" Saran's voice trembled. He blinked, confusion flickering over his face, as if waking from a dream he didn't want to admit to. I don't know. But he did know. Somewhere deep in his mind, behind the layers of fear he kept buried, he felt an urgency rising like a tide. Something demanded a sacrifice. And soon! Elsewhere in the village, David woke from another dream, this one stronger, sharper than before. He saw Samuel standing in a room covered with shadows. He saw Saran crying. He saw the charm burning with a dark light. And he heard a whisper, "The brother of your heart must choose. Or the shadow will choose for him." David felt the weight of the message, even though he didn't understand it fully. He knew he had to return to Samuel. He didn't want to go back, fear clung to him like a second skin, but he felt compelled. Something inside him pushed, the same strange instinct that kept drawing him to the church. He packed a small bag and left before sunrise, unaware that Father Chaik was watching him through the window. The priest whispered a prayer. "Guide him, Lord," for the path he walks was chosen long before his steps began. Back at the house, Samuel grew increasingly detached from reality. He spent hours staring at the floorboard, hiding the charm. He felt it calling to him, urging him to uncover it. Sometimes he resisted. Other times he found himself reaching for it without realizing it. Saran saw his struggle but didn't know how to help. She had finished her research. She knew what the charm represented. But she didn't dare reveal the truth, yet fearful that speaking of the pact could activate something darker inside Samuel. So she waited, hoping for the right moment. That moment came sooner than she expected. One evening, while she was preparing dinner, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the house despite the closed windows. The lights flickered. She heard a soft humming, low, rhythmic, like distant chanting. She froze. The sound came from Samuel's room. She pushed the door gently. Samuel sat on the floor, the charm in his hands. It glowed faintly. His lips moved, whispering words she had never heard before, ancient, steady, too calm. The sight made her chest tighten with terror. "Samuel!" she cried. He looked up slowly. His expression was serene, too serene, like a man surrendering to something inevitable. "It wants me to finish what began that night," he said calmly. "What began?" Her voice cracked. "The fire," he swallowed. "The death. The blood that opened the door." Saran stepped back unconsciously. She realized then that she could no longer wait. She had to tell him the truth she discovered. She had to try before the charm took the last of him. But before she could speak, Samuel froze. His eyes widened. A shadow crossed the room, quick and soft like a passing breath. He stood abruptly, as if someone pulled him to his feet. "They're here," he whispered. "Who?" she whispered back. He didn't answer, because he didn't know their names, only their hunger. That night, the whispering did not stop. The charm pulsed harder. And Samuel understood something terrible. The pact was no longer waiting, it was moving. And it was coming for what belonged to it. By the time David arrived at the house the next morning, the air around the property felt charged like a field before lightning strikes. He hesitated on the doorstep, sensing something immense pressing from the walls. but he knocked anyway. The door opened slowly. Saran stood there, her eyes exhausted, her voice trembling. "David, thank God you're here." He stepped inside, unaware that the house itself seemed to inhale as he entered. He didn't know yet that he had walked straight into the center of the pact's reach. And the cycle, ancient, hungry, and inescapable, had just tightened around all three of them. The morning light fell strangely over the house, dimmed as though passing through layers of dust that didn't exist. David felt it immediately. The moment he stepped into the living room, a tightening sensation gripped his chest like an invisible hand reminding him he should not have returned. But he pushed forward, guided by something stronger than fear. Saran closed the door behind him, not because she wanted to keep him in, but because she feared that, once open, something else might slip through. "Where is he?" David whispered. Saran didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the hallway, where shadows clung to the walls in unnatural shapes. "He barely slept," she said. "He's been listening to them." David stiffened. "Them?" She nodded, eyes glistening with exhaustion. "You'll see." They walked slowly down the corridor. Every step felt heavier, as though the floor resisted their weight. The house made soft sounds, not creaks, but breaths, almost rhythmic. David tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, but deep down he knew the truth. The charm had awakened something that lived through this place now. They reached Samuel's door. Saran knocked. A quiet voice answered. "Enter." When David stepped inside, he froze. Samuel stood by the window, his silhouette rigid against the pale light. His eyes were open, but unfocused, like someone looking past the world, into a place no one else could see. "Samuel," David said softly. Samuel turned slowly. A faint smile appeared on his lips, but it wasn't warm, it was tired, forced. The kind of smile meant to reassure someone while hiding an inner collapse. "You came," Samuel murmured. David nodded. "I had to." Samuel studied him for a long moment. "Why?" David hesitated. He didn't know the full answer. He only knew pieces, dreams, instincts, strange pushes toward the church, and now toward Samuel. "I think something wants me here." Saran's breath caught. Samuel's expression shifted, the smile fading. "Yes," he whispered. "Something does." The room fell silent. Then Samuel walked toward the floorboard. He knelt, slowly lifting the wooden plank. The charm sat beneath it, dark and still. Yet David could sense its energy vibrating faintly through the air. "You found it again?" David asked. Samuel shook his head. "It never leaves me. Even when I hide it, it finds a way back. This house listens to it." As he spoke, David felt a shiver run down his spine. He stepped back subconsciously. Saran watched Samuel with trembling hands. "Tell him what you told me last night," she urged. Samuel closed his eyes. His voice lowered into a hollow whisper. "It spoke to me." David swallowed. "What did it say?" "That the pact is older than our families," Samuel murmured. "Older than the village. It feeds on legacies generation after generation. It doesn't pick randomly. It chooses the ones who carry potential." David frowned. "Potential?" "To complete what the last one could not," Samuel said, opening his eyes. "It wants balance. A life taken must be replaced. A life spared must be justified." Saran stepped closer, her voice shaking. "And last night Samuel said something terrifying." She looked at David. "He said that you are part of the balance." David froze. Samuel looked at him with deep sorrow. "I didn't want to say it, but it told me clearly." He lifted his hand slowly and pointed at David's chest. "You were chosen long before I was." David felt the air vanish from his lungs. The room seemed to tilt. Chosen? For what? Samuel's gaze darkened with something between fear and certainty. For the next exchange. Before David could respond, the house groaned low, deep, trembling. A wind swept through the room, though the windows were closed. The charm trembled on the floorboard, vibrating as though something invisible touched it. Saran gasped, clutching David's arm. "It's starting again." Samuel pressed his palms to his temples, wincing. "They're coming closer. They want me to finish what I didn't." David stepped forward. "Samuel, look at me. You didn't do anything. You resisted. That means something." A shadow flickered suddenly across the wall, quick, gliding like a ripple in darkness. Saran stiffened. "Samuel, they're here." Samuel's breathing grew shallow. I know. David tried to stay calm. Why now? Samuel answered with a trembling voice. Because I fought the first command, and when the pact fails once, it becomes impatient. The floorboards beneath them vibrated softly, as though something moved beneath the wooden planks. Saran took another step back, but the door slammed shut on its own. She cried out, clutching David's sleeve. Don't panic, David whispered. Don't. A sharp whisper cut through the room, not in English. Not in any language they recognized. A voice, layered and echoing, spoke through the walls, not loud, but cold enough to freeze the marrow. He was spared. He must be replaced. Samuel flinched as though struck. Stop, please, he murmured. Another whisper chased the first, curling through the air like smoke. Blood cannot be denied. What was opened must be fed. David stepped between Samuel and the charm without thinking. Stop talking to it, he snapped. Stop answering. Samuel looked at him with sudden intensity. I'm not answering. It's answering me. Then the room shifted. The temperature plunged. The shadows stretched along the floor, reaching toward the charm. David grabbed Samuel's shoulders. You haven't lost. Whatever this pact wants, you can resist it. Samuel shook his head weakly. You don't understand. It doesn't want me. Those words hit David like a blow. Saran covered her mouth, her voice a whisper. David, he means. Samuel looked up, tears filling his eyes. It wants you. David stepped back, breath trembling. Me? Why? Samuel's voice cracked. Because the charm chooses the one whose heart is tied to the sacrifice. David froze. I don't understand. Samuel exhaled shakily. You're not my brother by blood, but by fate. That's what it said. The charm looks for bonds that imitate lineage. You are the brother the fire gave me. And the pact. Once the bond paid in blood. Saran shook her head violently. No. This can't be. The house groaned again. Then suddenly, the whispering stopped. A silence fell deep, suffocating, absolute. For a moment, they couldn't breathe. Then Samuel's eyes widened. It's shifting. The charm rose slowly from the floorboard, not floating completely, but lifting just enough to tilt, drawn toward David like a needle turning to north. David stumbled back. Saran grabbed his arm. We have to leave, now. She reached for the doorknob, but the handle twisted on its own, resisting violently. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. Darkness swallowed the room. David's heart hammered. Samuel? Saran? No answer. Only breathing. Then, a faint glow grew from the charm. Soft at first, then brighter, then pulsing. Samuel fell to his knees, clutching his head. It's choosing? It's choosing now, Saran screamed. David, move! But just as the charm's light flashed toward him, the house itself shook, as if something enormous struck its foundations. The charm dropped. The darkness broke, and a single distant bell rang. 3 slow chimes. David knew that sound, the church bell. Something had intervened, something stronger than the pact, even if only temporarily. Samuel collapsed forward, gasping for breath, freed for just a moment from the pressure on his mind. Saran sank beside him, trembling. David stood frozen, staring at the charm as its glow dimmed like a dying ember. He didn't know how to explain it. He didn't understand why. But he knew with absolute clarity one truth. Whatever force had pulled him to the church, whatever instinct that guided his steps, it had just stopped the pact's next move, and the charm knew it. The room filled with a soft, resentful hum, angry, injured, waiting. The battle was not over. It had only paused. David exhaled shakily, glancing toward the door. Samuel, he whispered. Samuel raised his head slowly. David's next words were quiet, but heavy with a new, terrifying certainty. The pact doesn't want you anymore. It wants me. And I think it's been wanting me from the beginning.